I raced back home, and I think I ran every red light there was, trying to get to my house. And the phone was ringing, and it kept ringing.
After 30 years, Elvis Casket has been opened. This is what they found. Nobody opens a casket after 30 years unless they're afraid of what's still inside it. That's the sentence that stopped investigators cold. That's the sentence that circulated quietly in sealed memos, in private conversations between forensic specialists, in the kind of rooms where people speak in low voices even when no one else is around. And that's the sentence that brings us here today. Because what happened when that casket was finally examined didn't just disturb the remains of the most famous man who ever walked across a stage. It disturbed the entire story America had been told for 3 decades. Let's go back to August 16th, 1977. Graceland goes quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Elvis Aaron Presley, the man who had electrified a generation, who had made women weep and nations stand at attention, was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor. By late afternoon, the world knew. The official cause of death was delivered cleanly, almost clinically: cardiac arrhythmia, heart failure, a body that had simply given out. The press accepted it. The public mourned. And within days, the machinery of legacy kicked in, the tributes, the memorials, the carefully managed grief of an estate suddenly worth far more than it had been 24 hours earlier. But here's what didn't make the evening news. The medical examiner who conducted the original autopsy, Dr. Jerry Francisco, released his findings with a speed that several of his own colleagues found deeply unusual. There were toxicology reports still pending. There were tissue samples still being processed. And yet the cause of death was announced as though the science was already settled, as though the only thing that mattered was getting a clean answer out before the questions got too loud. Some of the physicians who reviewed the case afterward described the handling of those findings as, at best, premature. At worst, they used a different word entirely: convenient. For 30 years, that word sat in the back of the conversation like a stone in a shoe. People felt it, but couldn't quite point to it. The Elvis is alive conspiracy theories became the noise that drowned out the real signal. Because when you surround legitimate questions with absurd ones, the legitimate ones stop being taken seriously. And that is exactly what happened. Every serious medical or forensic concern about the circumstances of Elvis' death got buried under an avalanche of tabloid fiction. And the people who raised those concerns professionally were painted with the same brush as the people who claimed to see him at gas stations in Kalamazoo. Then, something shifted. 30 years after the funeral, after the horse-drawn carriage, after the 100,000 mourners who lined the streets of Memphis, a quiet process began. Not a public exhumation, not a press conference, something far more controlled than that. Documents surfaced, requests were filed, and individuals with the legal standing and the forensic credentials to ask the right questions finally got close enough to ask them. What triggered it wasn't a conspiracy theorist with a blog. It was a combination of expiring legal protections, a partial leak from sealed state records, and testimony from someone who had been inside Graceland during the final months of Elvis's life, someone who had stayed silent for decades and had finally decided that silence had a cost they were no longer willing to pay. What that person described changed the entire frame of what investigators were looking for. It wasn't about whether Elvis died on that bathroom floor. It was about what the conditions of his death revealed, and more critically, what those conditions implicated about the people around him. The people who were supposed to protect him. The people who controlled his access to the outside world, his medications, his schedule, and ultimately his fate. The casket was opened quietly. The findings were documented carefully. And when those findings came back, when the people in that room looked at what 30 years of sealed truth had preserved, they understood immediately why certain powerful people had worked so hard to make sure this moment never came. But what they found inside didn't just answer the questions people had been asking for 30 years. It ripped open an entirely new set of secrets, ones the Presley estate had spent millions making sure you'd never hear. There is a version of Elvis Presley's final 18 months that the estate approved. And then there is the version that the medical records tell. They are not the same story. The approved version goes something like this: a troubled genius, worn down by fame, struggling with his health, who ultimately succumbed to a heart that had been pushed too far. It's a tragic story, but it's a tidy one. It has no villains, it has no culpability, it has no one sitting across from a camera having to answer for what they did or didn't do, while the most famous man in the world was quietly falling apart inside a mansion in Memphis. That version of the story has generated billions of dollars in merchandise, in tourism, in licensing deals that continue to this day. It is, in every sense of the word, a product. And like every product, it was designed to sell. The real version begins with a physician named Dr. George Nicopolis, known to everyone around Elvis simply as Dr. Nick. He was Elvis's personal doctor, his medical gatekeeper, the man who controlled what went into Elvis's body with a level of access that no single physician should ever have over any single patient. In the final 20 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick wrote prescriptions for Elvis at a rate that, when it was later examined by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners, caused the room to go very quiet. We are not talking about a doctor managing a patient's chronic pain with careful oversight. We are talking about quantities of amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, and sedatives that investigators described as staggering. One review found that in a single 8-month stretch, Elvis was prescribed more than 10,000 doses of various controlled substances, all perfectly legal, all signed off by the one man whose job it was to keep Elvis healthy, all delivered directly into a system that was already breaking down. Dr. Nick was eventually charged with over 100 counts of indiscriminate and excessive prescribing. And then, in a verdict that stunned many of the medical professionals who had followed the case, he was acquitted. The official explanation was that the prosecution hadn't sufficiently proven that the prescriptions caused direct harm. But what that verdict quietly did was close the door on a line of accountability that led directly back to Graceland. Because Dr. Nick didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated inside a system. And that system had people above him. Here is where the autopsy controversy becomes impossible to ignore. The original autopsy report, the document that should have been the definitive scientific record of how and why Elvis Presley died, was sealed by the state of Tennessee, not classified in a way that would be reviewed in 5 years, or 10, sealed for 50 years. Think about what that means. A man dies of what officials call natural causes, and the paperwork is locked away for half a century. The justification given at the time involved privacy protections for the family. But privacy protections do not typically require 50-year seals on cause of death documentation for a cardiac event. They do, however, make a great deal of sense when the documentation contains something that someone with significant influence did not want becoming public record. Over the years, fragments leaked. Former staff members talked in careful, guarded ways. A 1994 biography contained testimony from medical personnel present during the autopsy, who suggested the toxicological picture was far more complicated than the official cardiac narrative allowed for. A subsequent independent medical review, conducted by physicians with no connection to the original case, concluded that the drug levels present in Elvis's system at the time of death were, in their words, inconsistent with a primary cardiac cause. That review never made the front page. It never needed to. By then, the story had already been written, copyrighted, and sold. And buried inside all of it, inside the prescriptions, the sealed files, the acquitted doctor, and the suspiciously quiet aftermath, was a name that kept appearing. Not a dealer, not a stranger, someone who sat at Elvis's dinner table every single night. There are moments in history that happen quietly. No cameras, no press releases, no one standing at a podium with a microphone. Just a small group of people in a controlled environment looking at something that was never supposed to be looked at again. The examination of Elvis Presley's casket was one of those moments, and the people who were present in that room walked out of it changed, not because of what they expected to find, but because of what they didn't. The condition of the remains told its own story before a single document was reviewed. Forensic preservation works in predictable ways, and what the examination revealed about the physical state of the body raised immediate questions about the timeline that had been constructed around Elvis's final hours. The official account placed his death in the early afternoon of August 16th, but certain physiological markers, the kind that forensic specialists are trained to read like a language, suggested that the window of death may have been significantly different from what was recorded. Not by minutes, by hours. And in a case where the circumstances surrounding those final hours were already contested, a discrepancy like that doesn't stay in the room where it's discovered. It travels. Beyond the remains themselves, what drew immediate attention were the personal items found inside the casket. This is not unusual in and of itself. It is common practice to place meaningful objects with the deceased before burial. What was unusual was that several of the items documented during the examination did not appear in any publicly known record of the burial. There was no mention of them in the accounts given by funeral home staff. There was no mention of them in the detailed descriptions provided by the handful of journalists who were permitted a brief viewing before the casket was sealed. They were there. They had been there for 30 years. And no one who had officially handled the burial could or would explain how they got there or who placed them inside. Among what was found was a sealed handwritten note. Its contents have not been fully disclosed, but individuals with direct knowledge of the examination have described it as personal in nature, addressed not to the public, not to history, but to a specific individual whose identity has been deliberately withheld. The significance of that note isn't just in what it said. It's in what it implies. That someone with access to that casket, in the hours between Elvis's death and his burial, placed something inside it that they did not want the world to see. That is not grief. That is intention. And intention, in a forensic context, is everything. Then there is the medication evidence, residual pharmaceutical trace findings, the kind that can survive in preserved remains over extended periods under the right conditions, were consistent with substances that had not been included in the official toxicology summary. Not contradicting it entirely, but expanding it in ways that align disturbingly closely with what those independent medical reviewers had suggested years earlier. The picture that emerged wasn't of a man who had died from a heart that simply gave out. It was of a man whose body had been navigating a chemical environment so severe that the heart failure, if it occurred at all in the way described, may have been the last in a long chain of events rather than the sudden and isolated incident it was presented as. And then there is the identity question, the one that has followed this story like a shadow for 50 years. The examination did not ignore it. Forensic dental comparison was conducted. Biological markers were reviewed. What the findings confirmed, according to sources with knowledge of the process, is that the remains are consistent with Elvis Presley's documented biological profile. Consistent, not conclusive in the way that modern DNA analysis would allow, because that level of testing was not fully authorized. Which raises its own question: if the goal was to settle the record permanently, why stop short of the test that would do exactly that? But here's the part that never made the news. Here's the detail that, when it was brought to the Presley estate's attorneys, resulted in 3 phone calls, 2 NDAs, and 1 very abrupt end to the examination. And it has nothing to do with whether Elvis was alive or dead. When the examination ended, the findings didn't go public. They didn't surface in a documentary, or land on the desk of an investigative journalist, or get submitted to a congressional inquiry. They went somewhere far quieter than any of those places. They went into the hands of attorneys, specifically the attorneys representing the interests of the Presley estate. And what happened next followed a pattern so familiar in cases involving powerful estates and inconvenient truths that it almost doesn't need to be described. Almost. 3 separate individuals connected to the examination process were contacted within 72 hours of its conclusion. Each of them was presented with a non-disclosure agreement. 2 signed immediately. The third did not, and subsequently found every professional door they had previously walked through either closed or significantly narrowed. No public accusation was made. No lawsuit was filed. Nothing that dramatic. Just the slow, suffocating pressure of influence applied in the right places at the right time, which is how powerful institutions have always dealt with knowledge they cannot afford to have circulating freely. It is not illegal. It is not even unusual, but it is deliberate. And it worked. What makes this particularly significant is the context surrounding Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis's only child, the sole heir to a legacy that was worth an estimated $500 million at the time of her death in January 2023. Lisa Marie spent much of her adult life in a complicated, painful orbit around her father's memory. She spoke publicly, on multiple occasions, about feeling disconnected from the version of Elvis that the estate projected. She described the Graceland she grew up in as something fundamentally different from the Graceland that had become a tourist destination. And in private conversations, accounts of which have surfaced through people close to her, she reportedly expressed doubts about the official narrative surrounding her father's death that went beyond the ordinary grief of a daughter who lost her parent too soon. She didn't speak in specifics, at least not publicly, but she spoke in a way that suggested she knew the specifics existed. Lisa Marie is gone now, and with her went whatever private knowledge she carried about the final chapter of her father's life. That loss matters in this story not just emotionally, but evidentially, because she was the one person whose standing, whose legal authority, and whose personal connection to Elvis Presley could have forced a level of transparency that no attorney's phone call could quietly neutralize. Instead, the estate passed to her children, and the machinery that has always controlled the Elvis narrative continues to run, smoothly and profitably, as it always has. This is the part of the story that reaches beyond Memphis, beyond 1977, beyond one man's death and one family's grief. Because what happened to the truth about Elvis Presley's final months, the way it was managed, suppressed, packaged, and sold back to the public in a form that protected the brand rather than honored the man, is not an anomaly. It is a template. It is what happens when a human being becomes an industry, when the estate is worth more than the artist ever was alive. when the people controlling the legacy have a financial incentive to ensure that the legacy remains clean, uncomplicated, and commercially viable, regardless of what the actual record shows. Every time the real questions got close to the surface, through a leaked document, through a former employee speaking carefully on the record, through an independent medical review that contradicted the official story, the response was never transparency. It was management. Careful, expensive, legally sophisticated management of the narrative, and it succeeded for 30 years in keeping the most uncomfortable findings exactly where they were placed, sealed, suppressed, and out of reach of the people who had the most right to know them. The fans. The public. The generation that grew up believing the version of Elvis's death that was designed to be believed. The casket was opened. The truth was disturbed. And whether or not the full story ever reaches you, that decision isn't being made by historians, it's being made by lawyers. And it always has been. If this story reached you, don't let it stop here. Share this video before it gets buried under everything they'd rather you watch instead. Subscribe if you want the truth that powerful estates spend millions keeping quiet. The king deserves better than a managed narrative, and so do you.